The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Windsor Castle as Prince Andrew walked briskly toward the main entrance. It was a typical Tuesday in October, and the Duke of York had just returned from a private meeting with senior palace officials. The discussions had been tense, focusing on his reduced royal duties and the ongoing scrutiny from the press. His mood was particularly sour that day, weighted down by the constant pressure and public criticism that had become his daily companion. As he approached the ornate entrance, Andrew noticed the familiar figure of Sergeant James Mitchell standing at attention. Mitchell had been serving as a royal guard for nearly 15 years, earning respect from his colleagues and superiors alike for his unwavering professionalism and dedication. He was known throughout the castle staff as someone who took his duties seriously, never breaking protocol and maintaining the highest standards of military bearing. The relationship between Prince Andrew and the guards had always been complex. While some royals maintained warm, informal relationships with their security detail, Andrew had developed a reputation for being demanding and sometimes dismissive. Staff members often whispered about his sharp comments and tendency to treat guards more like servants than the trained military professionals they were. On this particular morning, Andrew seemed in an especially confrontational mood. Perhaps it was the stress of recent events, or maybe the weight of his diminished status within the royal family, but something about Sergeant Mitchell's perfect posture and unwavering gaze seemed to irritate him. The guard stood motionless, his red tunic immaculate, his bearskin hat perfectly positioned, staring straight ahead as protocol demanded. Andrew paused directly in front of Mitchell, studying the guard's face for any reaction. The sergeant remained completely still, his eyes fixed on a point in the distance, following centuries-old traditions of royal protocol. This apparent indifference to his presence seemed to fuel Andrew's growing irritation. "You know," Andrew began, his voice carrying a tone of casual arrogance, "I've been wondering something about you guards." He walked slowly around Mitchell, inspecting him like a commanding officer reviewing troops, but with an air of superiority that went beyond military hierarchy. "Do you actually think while you're standing there, or do you just switch off your brain completely?" Mitchell remained silent and motionless as his training demanded. Royal guards were taught to ignore casual conversation, insults, and attempts to distract them from their duties. They were living statues, symbols of British military tradition and royal protection. But Andrew wasn't finished with his verbal prodding. "I mean, it must be mind-numbingly boring," Andrew continued, circling back to face the guard directly. "Standing there for hours, pretending to be important, when really you're just decoration. Like the paintings on the wall, except less interesting." His words carried a cruel edge, designed to provoke a reaction that would break the guard's professional composure. The other staff members who witnessed this exchange felt uncomfortable. Palace workers had seen Andrew's moods before, but this seemed particularly mean-spirited, even for him. Some looked away, embarrassed by the prince's behavior, while others watched nervously, hoping the situation wouldn't escalate further. Andrew stepped closer to Mitchell, now standing just inches from his face. "Tell me, Sergeant," he said, reading the name tag with exaggerated interest. "Mitchell, is it? What do you think about when you're standing here? Do you think about your little house, your ordinary wife, your mundane life outside these walls?" The prince's voice dripped with condescension, each word carefully chosen to demean and belittle. Still, Mitchell remained perfectly still, his breathing controlled, his expression unchanged. Years of military training had prepared him for far, worse than verbal harassment from entitled individuals. He had served in combat zones, faced real dangers, and earned his position through merit and dedication. This attempt at psychological warfare from a disgraced royal was merely another test of his professional resolve. Andrew's frustration grew as his taunts failed to produce the desired reaction. He had expected anger, embarrassment, or at least some flicker of emotion that would validate his sense of superiority. Instead, he was confronted with the unwavering professionalism of a man who understood his duty and refused to be drawn into petty games. "You know what I think?" Andrew said, his voice rising slightly. "I think you people enjoy this charade, standing around playing soldier when you're really just overpaid mannequins. At least mannequins in shop windows serve a purpose. They sell clothes. What exactly do you sell, Sergeant Mitchell? The illusion of security? The fantasy of British military might?" The cruel words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Several palace staff members who overheard the exchange felt a mixture of anger and embarrassment. They knew Mitchell as a decent man, a professional soldier who had served his country with honor. To see him subjected to this verbal abuse from someone whose own reputation was in tatters felt deeply wrong. But Mitchell remained unmoved, his training and personal integrity forming an impenetrable shield against Andrew's verbal assault. He understood that this moment was not about him or his service, but about a man struggling with his own failures and lashing out at anyone within reach. The guard's silence was not weakness. It was strength, dignity, and professional excellence in its purest form. Andrew, realizing his words were having no visible effect, felt his anger transform into something closer to desperation. He was accustomed to people reacting to his presence, whether with deference, fear, or at least acknowledgement. This complete indifference to his attempts at dominance was more unsettling than any direct confrontation would have been. The morning air grew heavy with tension as other guards and staff members became aware of the unfolding drama. Word began to spread quietly through the castle corridors that Prince Andrew was having another one of his episodes, taking out his frustrations on the very people sworn to protect him and his family. Little did Andrew know that his cruel joke was about to backfire in a way he never could have anticipated, and that Sergeant Mitchell's response, when it finally came, would become legendary among the palace staff and beyond. As Andrew's verbal assault continued, the tension in the courtyard became almost unbearable for the witnessing staff members. The prince seemed determined to break Sergeant Mitchell's professional composure, unaware that he was about to face something far more powerful than any angry outburst, the quiet dignity of a true professional. "I suppose," Andrew said with a smirk, "your silence is supposed to impress me? Make me think you're some sort of stoic hero?" He laughed, but it was a hollow sound that echoed off the ancient stone walls. "You're not in Afghanistan anymore. Sergeant, you're not protecting anyone important. You're just standing guard over empty corridors and tourist attractions." The reference to Mitchell's military service was particularly cruel. Andrew had done his research, or perhaps had been briefed by staff about the guard's background. Mitchell had indeed served 2 tours in Afghanistan, earning commendations for bravery under fire and leadership during difficult operations. He had seen friends killed, had carried wounded comrades to safety, and had faced dangers that few people could imagine. To have his service dismissed so callously by someone who had lived a life of privilege was especially painful. But Mitchell's training ran deeper than personal offense. He had sworn an oath to serve the crown, and that oath included protecting even those members of the royal family who showed little respect for the institution they represented. His silence was not submission. It was the embodiment of centuries, of military tradition and personal honor. Andrew, growing more frustrated by the lack of response, decided to push further. "You know what really bothers me about you silent types?" he said, walking in slow circles around the motionless guard. "You think your silence makes you superior. You think it makes you noble. But really you're just too cowardly to speak up for yourselves." Several palace staff members who had gathered at a respectful distance felt their anger rising. They knew Mitchell personally. He was a family man, devoted to his wife and 2 young children. He volunteered at local charities, helped elderly neighbors with their shopping, and had never spoken badly about anyone, even when provoked. To see him subjected to this unprovoked abuse was becoming increasingly difficult to witness. Lady Catherine Pemberton, the Queen's private secretary, appeared at the edge of the courtyard. She had heard raised voices and came to investigate, but upon seeing the situation, she hesitated. While she had the authority to intervene on behalf of the staff, directly confronting a member of the royal family required careful consideration. She decided to observe quietly, ready to step in if the situation escalated beyond verbal harassment. Meanwhile, Andrew continued his psychological assault, seemingly oblivious to the growing audience of uncomfortable observers. "I bet you go home to your little suburban house and tell your wife about your important job protecting the royal family," he said mockingly. "Does she believe you're doing something meaningful? Or does she know you're just an overpaid statue?" Through all, cruel words about Mitchell's family crossed a line that even the other royal guards noticed. Captain Harrison, the senior guard on duty, shifted uncomfortably at his post. Military protocol prevented him from intervening directly, but his respect for Mitchell and disgust at Andrew's behavior was evident in his rigid posture and clenched jaw. Andrew seemed to sense that he was losing his audience's tolerance, but instead of backing down, he doubled down on his cruelty. "Tell me, Sergeant Mitchell," he said, pronouncing the name with exaggerated formality. "What would happen if I ordered you to dance? Would you break your precious protocol then? Or would you just stand there like a mindless robot following your programming?" This was the moment when something subtle but significant changed in the atmosphere. Mitchell's breathing remained steady, his posture unchanged, but those who knew him well noticed a tiny shift, not in his expression, which remained perfectly neutral, but in something deeper. It was as if he had made a decision. Though what? That decision might be remained unclear. Andrew, oblivious to this subtle change, pressed on with his verbal assault. "I think I know what you're thinking," he said with confidence. "You're thinking about all the ways you'd like to tell me what you really think. You're probably composing angry letters in your head, imagining what you'd say if you weren't bound by all these silly rules and traditions." He was wrong, of course. Mitchell wasn't composing angry responses or imagining revenge. Instead, he was doing something far more dangerous to Andrew's ego. He was analyzing the situation with the cold, professional assessment of a trained military strategist. He was observing Andrew's behavior, noting his psychological state, and recognizing the deeper insecurities driving this unprovoked attack. The guard had dealt with bullies before, both in school and in the military. He understood that people who lashed out at others were usually fighting battles with themselves. Andrew's desperate need to establish dominance over a man who couldn't fight back revealed more about the prince's own weaknesses than any public scandal ever could. "You know what I think your problem is?" Andrew continued, apparently mistaking Mitchell's analytical silence for defeat. "You've been trained to be subservient for so long that you've forgotten how to be a real man. You've let the military turn you into a puppet. And now you can't even defend yourself when someone points out how pathetic your life has become." Lady Pemberton had heard enough. She began walking across the courtyard, her diplomatic training, kicking in as she prepared to diffuse the situation without creating a bigger scandal. But before she could reach them, something unexpected happened. Not from Mitchell, who remained perfectly still, but from the small group of staff members who had been watching the ugly scene unfold. James Morrison, a maintenance supervisor, who had worked at the castle for over 20 years, stepped forward slightly. He didn't speak or intervene directly, but his movement signaled something important. The staff's patience with Andrew's behavior was reaching its limit. Morrison was followed by Sarah Chen, a senior housekeeper, and then by Thomas Wright, the head groundskeeper. None of them spoke or acted inappropriately, but their silent solidarity with Mitchell was unmistakable. Andrew finally noticed the growing audience of staff members, and for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. He was used to having these confrontations in private, where his behavior wouldn't be witnessed and discussed throughout the castle. The presence of so many observers made him realize that his words and actions would likely be reported and remembered long after this moment passed. But instead of backing down gracefully, Andrew's narcissistic personality pushed him toward an even more dramatic escalation, setting the stage for Mitchell's eventual response that would echo through the palace corridors for years to come. The growing audience of palace staff seemed to fuel Andrew's determination to assert his dominance over the silent guard. Rather than feeling embarrassed by the public nature of his outburst, he appeared to relish having witnesses to what he clearly viewed as his superiority over a mere employee. His voice grew louder, more theatrical, as if he were performing for an audience rather than simply venting his frustrations. "Look at all these people gathering to watch," Andrew announced, gesturing broadly toward the assembled staff members. "I think they're curious to see what happens when someone finally calls out the Great Royal Guard charade. They want to see if their hero Sergeant Mitchell has anything intelligent to say for himself." Lady Pemberton continued her careful approach, her mind racing through diplomatic solutions to end this embarrassing spectacle without creating a larger incident. She knew that any direct confrontation with Andrew could escalate into a full-scale scandal, potentially damaging the already fragile reputation of the royal family. Yet she also felt a strong obligation to protect the palace staff from this kind of unprovoked harassment. Mitchell remained absolutely motionless, but his awareness extended far beyond Andrew's immediate presence. His peripheral vision caught sight of Lady Pemberton's approach, the positioning of his fellow guards, and the growing crowd of supportive colleagues. He was acutely aware that this moment had expanded beyond a simple confrontation between two individuals. It had become a test of institutional values and personal character. Andrew, drunk on his own performance, decided to make his joke even more elaborate. "You know what would be really funny?" he said, his voice taking on a tone of cruel amusement. "If I told you a joke right now, and you had to stand there and listen to it without being able to laugh or react. Would that be torture for you, Sergeant? Being forced to endure royal humor without the ability to respond appropriately?" The gathering staff members exchanged uncomfortable glances. They had all heard Andrew's attempts at humor before, and they were rarely amusing. More often they were crude, inappropriate, or designed to make others uncomfortable rather than to genuinely entertain. The prospect of watching him subject Mitchell to this additional humiliation felt almost unbearable. "Here's a good one," Andrew continued, clearly pleased with his own cleverness. "What's the difference between a royal guard and a scarecrow?" He paused dramatically, as if waiting for a response he knew wouldn't come. "The scarecrow is more useful because it actually keeps something away." He laughed at his own joke, a harsh sound that seemed to emphasize rather than relieve the tension in the courtyard. The staff members looked away, embarrassed not just for Mitchell but for Andrew himself, whose behavior was becoming increasingly unhinged and desperate. But Andrew wasn't finished with his performance. "Oh, I've got another one," he said, warming to his theme. "What do you call a royal guard who actually does something useful?" Again, he paused for the punchline. "Unemployed, because that would mean he broke protocol." The cruel jokes revealed more about Andrew's own insecurities than they did about Mitchell's duties. Each attempt at humor betrayed his resentment toward people who maintained their dignity and professional standards while his own reputation crumbled around him. He was projecting his own sense of uselessness onto someone whose service record spoke for itself. Captain Harrison, watching from his assigned position, felt his professional composure being tested to its limits. He had served under Mitchell in Afghanistan and knew firsthand the man's courage and leadership qualities. To watch him being subjected to this juvenile harassment by someone who had contributed nothing meaningful to military service or public duty was becoming almost unbearable. Mitchell, meanwhile, was processing far more than Andrew realized. His military training had taught him to assess threats not just in terms of immediate physical danger, but in terms of broader strategic implications. He understood that this confrontation was being witnessed by people whose opinions mattered, not just to his own career, but to the institution they all served. The guard was also acutely aware of the historical significance of the moment. Royal Guards had faced similar challenges throughout centuries of British history. They had maintained their dignity in the face of everything from enemy attacks to royal tantrums, from public mockery to personal tragedy. His response to this situation would either honor that tradition or diminish it. Andrew, oblivious to these deeper currents, continued his verbal assault with increasing desperation. "You know what's really pathetic about your job?" he asked, stepping even closer to Mitchell's face. "You spend your whole day protecting people who wouldn't cross the street to help you if you were in trouble. You're devoted to an institution that sees you as completely expendable." This particular barb hit closer to home than Andrew realized, not because it was true, but because it revealed his own relationship with the monarchy. Andrew was describing his own situation. A royal family member who had become an embarrassment, someone the institution now saw as a liability rather than an asset. His words were pure psychological projection, revealing his own fears about his expendability within the royal structure. The irony was lost on Andrew, but not on the observing staff members. They could see that Mitchell, despite his lower social rank, commanded far more respect within the palace community than the prince himself. The guard's quiet professionalism and genuine service had earned him admiration from colleagues at every level, while Andrew's behavior had gradually alienated even his most loyal supporters. Lady Pemberton was now close enough to intervene diplomatically, but she hesitated as she sensed something changing in the dynamic of the confrontation. Mitchell's posture remained unchanged, but there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere that suggested the guard was preparing to break his silence. After years of experience reading people and situations, she recognized the signs of someone who had reached a decision point. The moment of Mitchell's response was approaching, and when it came, it would demonstrate the difference between true nobility and mere aristocratic entitlement in a way that no one present would ever forget. The tension in the courtyard had reached a breaking point. Andrew's cruel monologue had continued for nearly 10 minutes, each word designed to humiliate and provoke. The gathered staff members watched in uncomfortable silence as their colleague endured this unprovoked assault on his character and service. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting sharp shadows that seemed to emphasize the stark contrast between Andrew's desperate cruelty and Mitchell's unwavering dignity. Andrew, perhaps sensing that his audience was growing weary of his performance, decided to escalate to what he clearly intended as his final, most devastating blow. "You want to know what I really think about you and all the other guards?" he asked, his voice dropping to a more intimate, conspiratorial tone that somehow felt even more menacing than his previous shouting. "I think you're all living in a fantasy. You dress up in these ridiculous costumes, you follow these meaningless protocols, and you pretend you're part of something important. But the truth is, you're just employees, hired help. The only difference between you and the people who clean our toilets is that you get to wear fancier uniforms while you do your meaningless jobs." The comparison to cleaning staff was particularly offensive, not because there was anything shameful about maintenance work, but because it revealed Andrew's contempt for anyone who worked for a living rather than living off inherited wealth and privilege. His words betrayed a worldview in which a person's value was determined solely by their social rank rather than their character or contributions. Mitchell had endured worse insults during his military service, but those had come from enemies in combat situations. Being subjected to this level of disrespect from someone he was sworn to protect felt different. It wasn't the words themselves that stung. It was the fundamental violation of the mutual respect that should exist between those who serve and those they serve. But Mitchell's response, when it finally came, would demonstrate a level of wisdom and strategic thinking that Andrew had completely underestimated. The guard had been carefully considering not just what to say, but when and how to say it for maximum impact. He understood that timing, in both military operations and personal confrontations, was everything. "And another thing," Andrew continued, apparently mistaking Mitchell's continued silence for defeat. "I don't understand why you all take this job so seriously. It's not like you're actually protecting anyone from real danger. When was the last time a royal guard actually had to do anything more challenging than stand still and look decorative?" This question would prove to be Andrew's fatal mistake. Of all the possible topics he could have chosen to mock, questioning the relevance and importance of royal protection was perhaps the most foolish. Mitchell had comprehensive knowledge of security threats, intelligence briefings, and the very real dangers that required constant vigilance to prevent. His silence had been protecting not just his own dignity, but sensitive information about ongoing security operations. Captain Harrison, watching from his position, recognized the strategic error Andrew had just made. By questioning the competence and relevance of royal security, the prince had inadvertently opened a door that Mitchell could walk through without violating any protocols. A response about the importance of royal protection would be entirely within the guard's professional responsibilities. Lady Pemberton, now close enough to intervene, but still hesitant to create a larger incident, noticed the subtle change in Mitchell's posture. His breathing remained controlled, his expression unchanged, but there was a shift in his energy that suggested the professional soldier was about to engage with a tactical problem that required resolution. The gathered staff members sensed it, too. After watching their colleague endure this unprovoked harassment with remarkable grace, they felt the anticipation of vindication approaching. They had seen Mitchell handle difficult situations before, and they knew that when he finally chose to speak, his words would be carefully chosen and devastatingly effective. Andrew, completely oblivious to the changing dynamics around him, pressed forward with what he intended as his killing blow. "Tell me, Sergeant Mitchell," he said, using the military rank with obvious mockery, "when you go home tonight and your wife asks you what you accomplished at work today, what exactly are you going to tell her? That you successfully stood motionless for 8 hours, that you protected the royal family from the terrible threat of tourists taking photographs?" The reference to Mitchell's wife was another strategic error. The guard's family life was something he held sacred, and bringing them into this confrontation added a personal dimension that changed the entire nature of the exchange. Andrew had just crossed from professional harassment into personal attack, giving Mitchell both the moral authority and the practical justification to respond. But Mitchell's response, when it came, would not be driven by anger or wounded pride. Instead, it would demonstrate the kind of strategic thinking and tactical awareness that had made him an effective leader during his military service. He had been analyzing Andrew's psychological state throughout the confrontation, identifying weaknesses and vulnerabilities that could be exploited not for revenge, but for education. The guard understood something that Andrew did not, that true power comes not from the ability to humiliate others, but from the strength to maintain one's principles under pressure. He had been preparing a response that would demonstrate this truth in a way that everyone present would remember for the rest of their lives. As Andrew paused in his monologue, clearly expecting some kind of emotional breakdown or angry outburst, from his victim, the courtyard fell into a heavy silence. The morning air seemed to hold its breath as Mitchell prepared to break his professional silence with words that would teach everyone present, especially Prince Andrew, a lesson about the difference between inherited privilege and earned respect. The moment of truth had arrived, and Mitchell's response would prove that sometimes the most devastating comeback is delivered not with shouting or anger, but with quiet dignity and unshakable professional integrity. The silence that followed Andrew's final insult seemed to stretch for eternity. The courtyard, which moments before had been filled with cruel laughter and harsh words, now held a tension so thick it was almost tangible. Every person present, from Lady Pemberton to the maintenance staff to the other guards, sensed that something significant was about to happen. Mitchell remained perfectly still for several more seconds, letting Andrew's words hang in the air like toxic fumes that would soon be cleared by fresh wind. When he finally began to move, it was with the deliberate precision of a professional soldier executing a carefully planned operation. His head turned slowly to face Andrew directly, his eyes making contact for the first time during the entire confrontation. The transformation was remarkable. Without changing his posture or breaking his professional bearing, Mitchell suddenly radiated a different kind of authority. This was not the passive resistance of someone being bullied, but the confident presence of a leader about to address a subordinate who had forgotten their place in the hierarchy of respect and competence. "Your Royal Highness," Mitchell began, his voice calm, clear, and carrying the kind of controlled power that comes from absolute certainty in one's position. The formal address was perfectly correct according to protocol, but it carried an undertone that made Andrew suddenly aware that he was about to be educated rather than simply answered. "You asked what I tell my wife when I go home each day," Mitchell continued, his words measured and precise. "I tell her that I had the honor of serving the Crown, protecting an institution that has provided stability and continuity to our nation for over 1,000 years. I tell her that I stood guard not just over buildings and people, but over the very idea that some things in this world are worth preserving and protecting." The words were delivered without any trace of anger or defensiveness, but their impact was immediate and devastating. Andrew's smug expression began to falter as he realized that he was no longer dealing with a silent victim, but with an articulate professional who was about to dismantle his entire worldview with surgical precision. Mitchell paused briefly, allowing his words to sink in before continuing. "You suggested that my job is meaningless, that I'm merely decorative. With respect, sir, I would like to clarify what my duties actually entail." His tone remained perfectly respectful, but there was an underlying strength that made it clear he was not seeking permission to speak. He was informing Andrew that he would be heard. "In the past month alone," Mitchell continued, "my colleagues and I have identified and neutralized 3 separate security threats to the royal family. We have coordinated with intelligence services to prevent 2 potential terrorist incidents. We have provided protection during 17 public engagements, ensuring the safety of not just the royal family, but of thousands of British citizens who came to show their support for the monarchy." Each fact was delivered with the precision of a military briefing, but the cumulative effect was to demonstrate just how completely Andrew had misunderstood the nature and importance of royal protection. The prince's face grew pale as he began to realize that his joke had revealed his own ignorance rather than Mitchell's inadequacy. "You asked about the last time a royal guard had to do something more challenging than stand still," Mitchell continued, his voice remaining steady and professional. 3 weeks ago, I personally tackled an individual who had concealed a knife and was attempting to approach the Queen's car during a public appearance. 2 months ago, my team prevented what intelligence services later confirmed was a planned assassination attempt during a state dinner. The gathered staff members watched in fascination as the power dynamic in the courtyard completely reversed. Andrew, who had begun this confrontation as the aggressor, now looked like a school child being lectured by a teacher who had finally lost patience with his misbehavior. But Mitchell was far from finished. Having established the professional competence that Andrew had questioned, he now moved to address the more personal attacks with the same calm authority. "You made several observations about my character and motivations," he said, "and I think it's important to address those as well. You suggested that I lack the courage to speak up for myself. I would respectfully submit that choosing when and how to engage in confrontation is not cowardice, it's strategic thinking. A soldier learns to pick his battles carefully, to fight only when the cause is worthy and the timing is right." The words carried an implicit criticism that was devastating in its restraint. Mitchell was essentially telling Andrew that he had not been worth engaging with until now, that his harassment had been so beneath notice that it hadn't warranted a response until it crossed the line from personal rudeness to professional ignorance. You questioned whether I think while standing at my post? Mitchell continued. I can assure you that my mind is constantly active, processing information, assessing threats, coordinating with other security personnel, and maintaining awareness of everything happening in my assigned area. The silence you interpreted as mindlessness is actually intense concentration and professional focus. Andrew's mouth opened slightly as if he wanted to interrupt, but no words came. He was beginning to understand that he had dramatically underestimated not just Mitchell's capabilities, but his own vulnerability in this exchange. The guard was systematically dismantling every assumption Andrew had made, exposing the prince's ignorance and arrogance with surgical precision. The most devastating part of Mitchell's response was still to come. Having addressed the professional and personal attacks, he was now prepared to deliver a lesson about leadership, service, and the true meaning of nobility that would haunt Andrew for years to come. The gathered observers sensed that they were witnessing something historic, a moment when quiet dignity and professional competence would triumph over entitled arrogance in a way that would be remembered and retold throughout the palace for generations. Mitchell's final words would become legendary throughout the palace, quoted and remembered long after the immediate participants had moved on with their lives. Having methodically addressed each of Andrew's attacks with professional composure, the guard was now ready to deliver the lesson that would define this encounter for everyone present. Your Royal Highness, Mitchell said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute moral authority. You spoke about the difference between those who serve and those who are served. I would like to offer a different perspective on that distinction. The courtyard had fallen completely silent. Even the usual background sounds of palace life seemed to have paused in anticipation of what was coming. Lady Pemberton, Captain Harrison, and all the gathered staff members recognized that they were about to witness something extraordinary. In my experience, Mitchell continued, true nobility is not determined by birth or title, but by how one treats others, especially those who cannot retaliate. It is measured not by what one inherits, but by what one contributes. It is defined not by the respect one demands, but by the respect one earns through character and conduct. These words struck Andrew like physical blows. Each phrase was carefully chosen to highlight the contrast between inherited privilege and earned dignity, between demanding respect and deserving it. Mitchell was not just defending himself, he was providing a masterclass in leadership and character that exposed Andrew's behavior as the antithesis of everything the monarchy claimed to represent. You question the value of my service, Mitchell said, his tone remaining perfectly respectful while delivering devastating truths. But service, sir, is not about the person being served. It is about the principles being upheld. I do not stand guard to protect any individual person's comfort or ego. I stand guard to protect the institution that represents the best aspirations of our nation. The implication was clear to everyone present. Mitchell served the crown and its ideals, not the flawed individuals who happened to wear it. His loyalty was to something higher than any single person's vanity or insecurity. This distinction elevated his position while simultaneously diminishing Andrew's attempt to assert personal dominance. Andrew's face had gone through several color changes during Mitchell's response, settling finally on a pale shade that suggested he was beginning to understand the magnitude of his error. He had expected to humiliate a subordinate, and instead found himself being educated by someone whose understanding of duty, honor, and service far exceeded his own. But Mitchell was not finished. Having established the philosophical foundation of true service, he was now prepared to deliver the observation that would be remembered and quoted throughout the palace for decades to come. You suggested that I think about my ordinary life and mundane concerns while standing at my post, Mitchell said, his voice taking on a tone of quiet reflection. You are correct that I do think about my family, my community, and my responsibilities beyond these walls. But I would suggest that thinking about ordinary people and their ordinary lives is not a distraction from noble service. It is the very heart of it. The words carried a power that seemed to resonate through the ancient stones of the castle itself. Mitchell was articulating a vision of service that connected the highest ideals of monarchy with the daily lives of common people, suggesting that true nobility lay in understanding and protecting that connection rather than in despising it. The crown I serve exists not for its own sake, but for the people it represents, Mitchell continued. Every ordinary family, every mundane concern, every simple hope and dream, these are what give meaning to the institution we protect. To serve the crown effectively, one must understand and respect the lives of ordinary people, because they are the reason the crown exists. Andrew stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, as he processed the implications of what he was hearing. Mitchell was essentially telling him that his contempt for ordinary people disqualified him from understanding the very institution he had been born to represent. The guard had turned Andrew's own snobbery against him, using it to demonstrate the prince's fundamental failure to grasp the true meaning of royal service. Mitchell paused for a moment, allowing the weight of his words to settle over the assembled group. When he spoke again, his voice carried a finality that indicated he was approaching the conclusion of his response. "You asked what I would tell my wife about my day," Mitchell said, returning to Andrew's original cruel question. "I will tell her that I had the opportunity to demonstrate that dignity is not diminished by silence, that strength is not measured by the ability to humiliate others, and that true service sometimes requires educating those who have forgotten the meaning of the institutions they represent." The silence that followed was profound and complete. Andrew's face cycled through expressions of shock, embarrassment, and dawning realization. He had initiated this confrontation expecting to demonstrate his superiority over a mere employee, but instead had received a lesson in leadership, character, and the true nature of service that exposed his own inadequacies with surgical precision. Lady Pemberton, who had been prepared to intervene diplomatically, realized that no intervention was necessary. Mitchell had handled the situation with such skill and professionalism that he had actually enhanced the dignity of the institution rather than creating a scandal. His response would be remembered not as insubordination, but as a masterful example of how to maintain one's principles under pressure. The gathered staff members looked at Mitchell with a mixture of admiration and awe. They had always respected him as a colleague, but now they saw him as something more, a person who had demonstrated that quiet dignity and professional competence could triumph over entitled arrogance without stooping to its level. Captain Harrison felt a surge of pride in his subordinate. Mitchell had not only defended himself and his profession with remarkable skill, but had done so in a way that honored military traditions and royal protocols, while delivering a lesson that everyone present would remember for the rest of their lives. Andrew, realizing that the confrontation had ended with his complete intellectual defeat, struggled to find words that might restore some semblance of his damaged dignity. But Mitchell's response had been so comprehensive, so perfectly calibrated, that any attempt at rebuttal would only make the prince's position worse. That is, Andrew began, but the words died in his throat. He had been so thoroughly outmaneuvered that even his considerable ego could not manufacture a face-saving response. The cruel jokes he had thought so clever now seemed petty and childish in comparison to Mitchell's measured wisdom. Mitchell returned to his position of attention, his brief departure from protocol now concluded. He stood once again in perfect military bearing. But something had changed. The staff members who witnessed his response would never again see him as merely a ceremonial figure. He had revealed himself to be exactly what Andrew had mocked, a thinking, feeling, highly competent professional whose silence was a choice, not a limitation. As Andrew finally turned and walked away, his steps lacking their earlier confidence, the gathered observers began to disperse. But they carried with them the memory of what they had witnessed, a moment when true nobility had been defined not by birth or title, but by character, wisdom, and the courage to speak truth to power, with dignity and respect. The story of Sergeant Mitchell's response spread quickly through the palace corridors, then beyond the castle walls. It became a legend whispered among staff members, shared among military personnel, and eventually found its way into the broader public consciousness as an example of how quiet dignity can triumph over arrogant privilege. Years later, when people spoke of this encounter, they would remember not Andrew's cruel jokes or his attempts at humiliation, but Mitchell's calm, devastating response that had transformed a moment of personal attack into a lesson about the true meaning of service. Nobility and human dignity. The silent guard had found his voice, and when he spoke, his words echoed far beyond the ancient walls of Windsor Castle, reminding everyone who heard the story that true power lies not in the ability to diminish others, but in the strength to elevate the principles we serve.